Harlem, New York. Friday afternoon, the 12th of February, 1965. For 47 minutes, two men sat across from each other in a small office above the Palm Cafe, a meeting so dangerous, so morally explosive, that it was never discussed publicly for decades. One was Bumpy Johnson, the aging but still feared king of Harlem's underworld, a man who had survived 40 years by mastering violence, intimidation, and absolute control. The other was Malcolm X, a hunted revolutionary who already knew his life was measured not in years, but in days. Bumpy Johnson made an offer that no rational man facing assassination would ever refuse. He offered to wipe out every enemy hunting Malcolm X, the shooters, the planners, the leadership who had ordered his death, even if it meant triggering a brutal war inside Black America. Money, guns, connections, murder on an unprecedented scale. Bumpy was willing to use all of it so Malcolm could live. Malcolm X said no. Instead of asking for protection, instead of choosing survival at any cost, Malcolm made a counter-request so radical that the three witnesses in the room could barely believe what they were hearing. He asked one of the most powerful criminals in America to do the one thing his entire empire was built to prevent. Stop allowing black men to kill other black men. No more murders over territory. No more executions over money. No more bloodshed between brothers. 9 days later, Malcolm X was assassinated in front of his wife, his children, and hundreds of witnesses. Harlem erupted. The world mourned, and Bumpy Johnson was left alone with a promise made to a man who was now dead, a promise that would cost him money, territory, power, and possibly his life. This is not the story of Malcolm X's death. This is the story of what happened after, when an aging gangster tried to honor the final request of a dying revolutionary, and in doing so, quietly changed Harlem forever. By early 1965, Malcolm X was no longer living with uncertainty. He wasn't guessing whether an assassination attempt would come, he was calculating when. His home had already been firebombed. Credible warnings flowed in from multiple cities. Men he once trusted inside the Nation of Islam were now openly hunting him, convinced they were carrying out a divine order. Malcolm understood the reality with brutal clarity. The decision to kill him had already been made, and it had been approved at the highest levels. He moved constantly, sleeping little, eating less. Friends later described him as physically exhausted but mentally calm, like a man who had crossed a psychological line and accepted that escape was no longer possible. What haunted him wasn't fear of death, it was the knowledge that his death would almost certainly come at the hands of black men, manipulated by leaders who hid corruption behind religious authority. That contradiction weighed heavily on him. Malcolm knew protection was limited. Even the most disciplined security could not guard every doorway, every public appearance, every unexpected moment. The nation had reach, numbers, and patience. They could wait. And Malcolm, despite his intelligence and courage, was only one man. He began focusing less on survival and more on what could still be done before he was killed, what final influence he could leave behind. That mindset led him to one last strategic meeting, not with politicians, not with activists, but with a man who understood power in its rawest form, someone whose resources extended far beyond speeches or protests. When Malcolm climbed the stairs to Bumpy Johnson's office on the 12th of February 1965, he wasn't looking for reassurance. He wasn't asking to be saved. He was preparing to confront a truth both men understood but rarely spoke aloud. Violence had become the default language inside their own community, and Malcolm's death would only deepen that cycle unless something changed. What Malcolm did not yet know was that Bumpy Johnson was about to offer him a way to live, a way that required more bloodshed than Harlem had seen in years. And Bumpy did not yet understand that Malcolm had already decided survival was no longer his highest priority. That realization would come next. When Malcolm X finished describing the men hunting him, the temples involved, the cities they came from, the certainty that the order to kill him had already been authorized, Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair and studied Malcolm's face in silence. He wasn't seeing panic. He wasn't seeing desperation. What he saw unsettled him far more: acceptance. The same look Johnson had seen countless times before, in men who knew they were already dead and were simply waiting for the moment it happened. That was when Bumpy decided to make his move. He stood, paced slowly behind his desk, then stopped and spoke plainly, without drama or raised voice the way men do when they're discussing something irrevocable. He told Malcolm that protection was no longer enough. Guards could fail. Safe houses could be compromised. Eventually, someone would get through. But there was another option, a permanent one. Bumpy explained that he could eliminate not just the shooters stalking Malcolm in New York, but the leadership who had ordered the assassination, the planners, the coordinators, even the men at the very top who had authorized the hunt. Within 2 weeks, he said, the Nation of Islam's leadership structure could be shattered so completely that no one would remain capable of carrying out the order. It would cost enormous sums of money. It would require calling in favors he had avoided for years. It would bring attention from law enforcement that he normally worked hard to keep away, but it could be done. If they all died, Malcolm would live. The room went silent. The 3 men witnessing the meeting understood exactly what they were hearing. One of the most powerful criminals in America offering to assassinate the leadership of a national religious organization, an act that would ignite a war and permanently alter Black America's political and criminal landscape. Bumpy wasn't boasting. He wasn't threatening. He was offering a service, the same one that had kept him alive for 4 decades. All he needed, he said, was permission. He needed Malcolm X to say yes, to accept that his survival would come at the cost of dozens of Black lives, to agree that staying alive mattered more than moral consistency, to acknowledge that violence, however ugly, was sometimes the only language power respected. Say yes, Bumpy told him, and you live. Your daughters grow up with their father. Your wife doesn't become a widow. Your voice doesn't get silenced. Malcolm X picked up his glass, finished the drink, and placed it carefully back on the desk. When he answered, his voice was steady. No hesitation. No uncertainty. No. Bumpy froze. He had expected resistance. He had expected doubt. He had not expected refusal. Not from a man staring down certain death. Not when the alternative was life. Malcolm explained that he had already thought through every consequence. Killing the nation's leaders might save him, but it would also mean dozens of Black men dying so one man could live a little longer. Men who were misled, manipulated, convinced they were serving a cause. He could not spend his life preaching against Black-on-Black violence while depending on it for his own survival. Bumpy stared at him, unable to hide his disbelief. From his perspective, Malcolm was choosing death. What Malcolm said next made it clear he understood that perfectly. And then, instead of accepting the offer, Malcolm made one of his own. After refusing the offer that could have saved his life, Malcolm X leaned forward in his chair. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. This was no longer a negotiation about protection or survival. The 3 witnesses later said they could feel it. Malcolm had not come there merely to listen. He had come with a purpose. Malcolm X spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, fully aware that what he was about to ask would sound irrational to a man who had built an empire on fear and force. He told Bumpy Johnson that killing his enemies would not honor him. Revenge would not protect the community. Another wave of bloodshed would only prove that nothing had changed, that Black men were still being pushed into killing one another for power, territory, and lies handed down from above. Then Malcolm made his counteroffer. He asked Bumpy Johnson to promise that after his death, he would stop allowing Black men to kill other Black men. Not selectively, not temporarily, no executions over money, no murders over territory, no retaliation wars between Black operators. He asked Bumpy to find other ways: negotiations, economic pressure, community influence, even beatings if necessary, anything except murder. He wanted the cycle broken, even if it meant weakening the very system that had kept Bumpy alive. The request stunned the room. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a direct challenge to everything Bumpy Johnson believed about power. Violence, Bumpy explained, was not optional in his world. It was the currency of respect, the deterrent that kept rivals from testing boundaries. If word spread that killing was off the table, challenges would multiply, territory would be lost, authority would erode, his empire could collapse. Malcolm did not argue. He acknowledged every risk. He knew exactly what he was asking. He was asking Bumpy to risk money, territory, and reputation, not for personal gain, but for a principle. If the most feared man in Harlem stopped killing his own people, Malcolm argued, others would follow. Younger operators would learn different methods. The bloodshed would not end overnight, but it would begin to slow. And that, Malcolm said, mattered more than his own life. As Malcolm stood to leave, he turned back one final time. He told Bumpy that his death was inevitable and that the men who killed him would be black. He refused to let his survival come at the cost of dozens of other lives. But once Bumpy saw what black-on-black violence looked like in its rawest form, once Malcolm was gone, he wanted him to remember this conversation, to choose whether the cycle would continue or finally break. Malcolm asked him for one last thing, a promise. Bumpy Johnson did not answer immediately. The request felt impossible, dangerous, almost suicidal. But before he could respond, Malcolm X nodded, as if he already understood the weight of what he had asked, and walked out of the office into the cold Harlem afternoon. 9 days later, Malcolm X was dead, and Bumpy Johnson was left alone with a decision he could no longer avoid. On Sunday afternoon, the 21st of February 1965, the inevitable arrived. Malcolm X stepped onto the stage at the Audubon Ballroom, preparing to speak before a crowd of several hundred people. His wife and young daughters were in the audience. Within moments, chaos erupted. 3 black men rushed forward, weapons drawn. Gunfire tore through the room. When it ended, Malcolm X lay collapsed on the stage, his body riddled with bullets. His life ended in front of the very community he had spent years trying to awaken. The news traveled fast. Harlem froze, then boiled. Anger, grief, and fear spilled into the streets. For many, the assassination felt like confirmation of something deeply broken, a movement devouring its own voice. For Bumpy Johnson, the call came mid-afternoon. By the time he reached the hospital, the corridors were already filled with police, reporters, Nation of Islam members denying involvement, and Malcolm's associates shouting that they had been betrayed. Bumpy did not try to speak to Malcolm's widow. There were no words that could exist in that moment. He stood back, watching the aftermath of the very violence Malcolm had warned him about black men killing another black man who was trying to change their future. The reality hit him with a weight no threat or rival ever had. He had failed. He had known the assassination was coming. He had offered a way to stop it, and yet Malcolm was dead. That night, Bumpy returned home alone. He dismissed visitors, turned off the lights, and sat with a bottle of bourbon, replaying every word spoken in that office 9 days earlier. Malcolm's request echoed again and again in his mind, not as idealism, but as accusation. Stop the cycle. Don't answer death with more death. By Monday morning, Bumpy made his first decision. It shocked everyone around him. There would be no retaliation, no orders to hunt down the shooters, no war against the Nation of Islam, no revenge killings to reassert dominance. His associates protested immediately, warning that restraint would be seen as weakness, that rivals would test his territory, that bloodshed was the only language understood in their world. Bumpy cut them off. Malcolm didn't want that, he told them. Malcolm refused to let dozens of black men die so he could live. And if Bumpy couldn't save him while he was alive, the least he could do was honor his wishes after death. No revenge, no killings. Not now. It was not yet the full promise Malcolm had asked for, but it was the first break in a pattern Bumpy Johnson had followed for 40 years, and Harlem was about to test whether that restraint was strength or suicide. The days following Malcolm X's assassination became the most dangerous period of Bumpy Johnson's career, not because of open war, but because of restraint. Word spread quickly through Harlem that Bumpy had chosen not to retaliate. To many, it sounded impossible. To others, it sounded like weakness. Younger operators began probing his territory, quietly testing whether the old rules still applied. Under the methods Bumpy had used for 40 years, these challenges would have been answered with swift, lethal force. This time, no one died. Instead, Bumpy did something that confused even his closest men. He called another meeting. 6 days after Malcolm's death, he told his organization that the temporary restraint was no longer temporary. He had spent the week replaying Malcolm's words, weighing the cost, and accepting the truth that frightened him most. The promise was possible, but only if he was willing to lose what violence had once protected. From that moment forward, Bumpy announced a new principle: no killing of black men, not rival operators, not challengers, not anyone. Disputes would be handled through negotiation, economic pressure, political leverage, community influence, and if absolutely necessary, controlled physical force that stopped short of murder. Anyone unwilling to accept that rule was free to leave. No one did. The transformation began immediately. When rivals attempted to exploit his restraint, Bumpy responded with methods he later called Malcolm's Way. Supply lines were cut off. Printers, drivers, and financiers were forced to choose sides. Community leaders were quietly mobilized to isolate offenders. Police attention was redirected through connections Bumpy had cultivated for decades. In cases where threats persisted, violence was used but calibrated, deliberate, and non-lethal. The message was clear: he would not kill, but he would not be ignored. This new approach came at a cost. Territory was surrendered to avoid bloodshed. Revenue declined as Bumpy chose compromise over war. His reputation shifted, no longer the most feared man in Harlem, but increasingly the most disciplined. Challenges increased precisely because people believed he had gone soft. Each test forced Bumpy to prove, again and again, that refusing to kill did not mean surrendering control. Privately, his associates questioned whether the sacrifice was worth it. Bumpy's answer never changed. Malcolm X died because black men could not resolve conflict without murder. If honoring that request cost him money and power, it was a small price compared to what Malcolm had paid. He had given his life trying to stop the violence. Bumpy would give up profit to try and finish the work. For 3 years, Bumpy Johnson lived inside that contradiction, a crime boss attempting to govern without the ultimate weapon he had once relied on. Every day tested the promise. Every conflict threatened to break it. But remarkably, the promise held. By the time Bumpy Johnson collapsed from a heart attack in July 1968, 3 years had passed since the day Malcolm X was murdered at the Audubon Ballroom. In those 3 years, Bumpy had not rebuilt his empire to its former size. He had not expanded territory. He had not increased profits. In many ways, he had done the opposite, and he knew it. His income dropped. Roughly 15% of his operations slipped into rival hands. Challenges became more frequent because people believed he would no longer cross the final line. But something else happened in Harlem, something quieter, harder to measure, and far more lasting. Murders between black criminal operators declined sharply. Conflicts that once ended in executions were dragged into negotiations, arbitrations, and economic warfare. Killing stopped being the first answer. It didn't disappear, that would be a lie, but it lost its automatic status. Inside the underworld, a new understanding slowly took hold. Violence carried consequences beyond territory and money. It carried moral weight. When Bumpy died at age 62, thousands attended his funeral, criminals and community members alike. Many came not to honor his power, but to acknowledge his attempt to change. After his death, the men who inherited his operations tried to maintain what they called Malcolm's method. Not perfectly, not without failures, but enough that the shift endured. Councils replaced vendettas. Mediation replaced reflexive murder. Even rival organizations began to adopt similar principles, recognizing that fewer internal killings meant more stability and fewer funerals. Criminological studies later showed what street-level observers already knew: Organized crime murders among black operators in Harlem dropped dramatically after 1965. Hundreds of lives were not lost. Cycles were interrupted. Children grew up with fathers who, in an earlier era, would have been killed. Malcolm X never lived to see it. His legacy is often measured through speeches, movements, and ideology. But one of his most tangible impacts happened behind closed doors, in a 47-minute conversation that produced no headlines and no applause. He refused to let dozens of black men die so he could live a little longer. Instead, he asked one powerful man to try something harder than violence. Bumpy Johnson kept that promise. Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently enough to matter. And in a place where history is usually written in blood, that promise changed Harlem not through power, but through restraint. History remembers Malcolm X as a voice powerful, uncompromising, and dangerous to those who benefited from division. History remembers Bumpy Johnson as a kingpin, ruthless, feared, and forged by violence. But what history almost forgot was the moment when those two stories briefly intersected, not in public, not on a stage, but in a quiet room where survival was offered and refused. Malcolm X could have lived. He was given that option plainly. He chose not to, because the cost was too high. He understood something few people facing death ever do, that living longer means nothing if it requires destroying the very people you claim to fight for. Instead of asking for protection, he asked for change and trusted that one man with enough power might actually try. Bumpy Johnson was not a saint. He did not abandon crime. He did not erase violence from Harlem. But for the final years of his life, he did something far more difficult than killing enemies. He restrained himself. He absorbed losses. He chose negotiation over execution. And because of that choice, fewer black men were buried, fewer families were shattered, and a cycle that once felt inevitable was weakened. That is the part of Malcolm X's legacy no speech can capture. Not the words shouted to crowds, but the principle spoken privately to one man who lived by fear. Stop the cycle. Don't answer death with more death. Bumpy Johnson kept that promise long enough for it to matter. And the question that remains is not what these two men were, a revolutionary and a criminal, but what their story asks of anyone who holds power today. When violence is easy, when revenge feels justified, when killing seems like the fastest solution, is restraint weakness, or is it the rarest form of strength? That was the promise. That was the cost. And that was how one conversation quietly changed Harlem forever.